Just out of college, and despite having a degree, it was almost impossible for me to get a job. Day after day, week after week, I sent out my resume to every game developer and computer company in the country, and a few in Europe and Asia. 6 months into this, my money was running very low. This was when I was forced to face the facts. I needed the job immediately. And it didn't matter where and for how much. Just in time, I found a job listing for a video game store at the mall. You know, the one I mean, and the terrible stories you hear about them are almost always true. Because of my background in games, I was given an interview immediately and hired soon after. My first shift was the following morning. Then a few hiccups along the way it kept my head above water. And so I got on with Dell 2 years later. The meat of the facts began just before my second year was about to start. Because of the high turnover, I was made an assistant manager by month 9. None of my shifts were evening. So I was tasked with keeping the younger employees in mind. A job I never really took seriously since I was only a few years older than they were. I didn't care how they acted as long as they did their job. Around this time, a girl was hired that could have been my undoing. The second I saw her, I knew she would be a problem. However, it wasn't just her that was the source of trouble. Her super jealous boyfriend became a thorn in the side of every guy that worked with her and sometimes just spoke to her. A shift of hers didn't go by without him showing up to check on her. Some nights he would do no more than sit on a bench outside the store and watch her work. But anytime she would get too close to a guy for his liking, he'd approach them and physically intimidate the guy she was talking to. She never said a thing when this happened. Actually, think she kind of liked it. But it would be what would push her away from him. In the end, she'd worked at the store for a couple of weeks before someone showed her the hallways that ran along the back of every place. She took advantage of the fact he wasn't aware of them. And this turned out to be a big mistake. If any person reading this doesn't know what I'm talking about, pay attention. You're about to learn something. I'm not sure how common this is. But some indoor malls, those built in the old way where each store inhabited in the area that leased from the mall owner. There are a network of paths or halls that run behind each business that are used mainly by the employees. The system allows them to enter and leave the jobs without being seen by the customers. Although I'm pretty sure their intended purpose was to give janitorial staff an uncluttered pathway to maintain the spaces. That being said, and all my time at that job, I only saw a member of the cleaning staff a handful of times. Most of those times they were sneaking a cigarette rather than working. Luckily, we could still smoke inside the building back then. No one said anything to the office if they caught you, probably because they were doing the same thing on their breaks. If we are all on the same page now, I'll get to the real story. Like I said, his jealousy, no matter how it turned her on, was at the same time pushing her away. On a break, she'd often sneak out the back and disappear for a while. Where she went, I had no idea really cared. The boyfriend took forever to catch on. But when he did, he was super angry. She continued this routine for a few months, and just one day she never came back to the store. I didn't attach any importance to this. It was during the holidays and work was a nightmare. It wasn't uncommon for employees to go on break after an especially hectic rush and not return. The turnover was simply that bad. Things got a bit more interesting. About 4 or 5 days later, the police showed up and had some questions about her disappearance. I was like, disappearance, what's going on here? They then informed me that she had been reported missing the day after she bailed on work by her parents. She had never made it home and they thought we may know something. The crazy thing was that when they visited her boyfriend's place to see if she was there, in addition to him not being there, after some digging, they learned that nobody had seen either of them for about a week. I was quick to make it clear that I didn't know anything. I just assumed she got sick of the place and bailed. I guess they were happy with that. Never heard from them again. Times passed and the situation around her almost faded completely from my mind until something really big in February happened and brought it back into crystal clarity. Some workmen were renovating one of the storage spaces for an incoming client. And once they had completed emptying the space of what the previous renters had left behind, they began the undertaking of finding the source of a terrible smell. Initially, it had been inferred that the smell was emanating from some old food products left behind in the space. But even after the clearing, the stink remained. The next theory was that an animal like a rat had died in the wall. It had happened before. So before they went to the extreme of busting holes in the walls to find the source of the smell, and they went next door to the adjoining space that was also empty, and had been for some time. They spent close to an hour sifting through tons of old displays and leftover building materials. It turned out that the mall had been using this space for years as storage and the place was a mess. The two guys tasked with doing this were about to say forget it, when one of them stumbled upon the source of the stink, and it definitely wasn't a rat. Someone had taken a large piece of plywood and put it over a tiny little closet, thus making it invisible. The guy had caught on that the smell grew worse as he got closer to this board. So he pushed aside the heavy display rack holding the board against the wall. And as soon as he pulled back the board, he found what was causing it. The semi-mummified body of what looked like a female was lying on the floor facing the wall. It appeared the arid and dry Arizona heat had preserved the corpse and suppressed decomposition. This handle had been wired, wasn't stinking up the entire mall, and managed to remain hidden for so long. Naturally, the mall was alive with talk of who the body could possibly belong to. Numbers of people had just stopped coming to work one day or skipped out during their lunch. We'd gone through at least 15 people in the last year ourselves. When the answer came, no one could have guessed who it was. Early one morning, I was awakened by my manager with the news that Becky Morrison was the person they found in the empty store. My only answer was who? He reminded me that she was the girl with a crazy jealous boyfriend that had disappeared just before Christmas. I hung up and went back to sleep. When I returned from my shift that night, who was the only thing anyone could talk about. The next question asked was, who did it? The overall favorite was the crazy boyfriend. And everyone knew by now that he had disappeared just after her. And considering his body wasn't found alongside hers, and was a fair assumption, he was most definitely nuts. It made sense. The story took a whole new angle just a couple of weeks after she was identified. An article was published in the paper discussing a possible new motive behind this. The police had recently received information that Becky had been messing around with a fellow mall employee during her breaks. They were meeting in the unoccupied store her body had been discovered in and fooling around. After following some leads, they were able to identify the employee. He was a 22-year-old guy working in the Hallmark store, but no name was given. He told the officers that he and Becky were supposed to hook up the day she disappeared. But he got holed up by the time he had reached the empty space and she was gone. He figured she couldn't wait and returned to work. It was only a few days later, when the cops showed up at the mall to ask questions, that he heard she was missing. His mind went straight to the worst and he was afraid he'd be blamed for it. So he said nothing. Then, when the news reached him that the boyfriend was also missing, it was too late. He figured if the boyfriend was hiding out waiting for his chance to get him, it was best for him to say nothing. Just on the off chance he didn't know for sure who the guy was. It all boiled down to him being afraid, and with what I knew I could understand what nobody knew, and still probably doesn't, is that her and I had a thing for a short while too. It wasn't long, but once is all it takes. I was the person who told her about the back hallways after all. We slipped out there a few times to mess around. Fortunately, we never got busted when she moved on to the next guy. I wasn't hurt. I knew she had a boyfriend anyway. Now you know why I had to act as if though I didn't care about her. We figured it was the safest thing for the both of us. Turns out we were right. I was overjoyed. No one knew about us. If the dude was crazy enough to strangle her for cheating, which seemed to be the reason, he would no doubt come after the dude she was with. I felt sorry for the Hallmark guy. It wouldn't take much mental math to figure out who he was if he didn't already know. And since they still haven't found him to this day, the fear of her boyfriend popping up out of nowhere and putting some holes in him must have been real strong. I know I was looking over my shoulder for several years after the police had this theory that he may have ended his life not long after. There hadn't been any activity on his bank account or card for years, and I still wasn't taking any chances. 9 years later, a week doesn't go by that I don't think about her. An outsider may have seen her as an easy girl, but I still don't think of her that way. It struck me that she was just looking for a guy that would treat her well and commit to her for the long term without being psychotic about it. She was genuinely a good person, and certainly didn't deserve the end she had, but then again, I can't think of very many that do. The week leading up to the Christmas holiday, my family, consisting of one son, a daughter, my wife and myself, took a last-minute trip to a small outlet mall-type place about 20 miles away from our home. We had 1 or 2 presidents left to get in. We knew the place had what we needed. After 3+ hours of shopping, the whole family was beginning to complain about being hungry. The food court contained this little Italian place that had awesome spaghetti and lasagna, so when we chose it, it came as no surprise that my son wanted chicken nuggets and fries. They made up a good 95% of his diet. Unfortunately, on this occasion, the Italian food wasn't that good. All 3 of us eating it thought it tasted a little funny, but because we were starving, most of it was eaten. My son, on the other hand, was pleased with his, and had me wishing I would have just chosen Chick-fil-A too. Although we didn't like it, none of us felt bad or had any reason to believe anything was wrong with our food. No one said so at the time, at least. When everyone finished their meals, we headed home. The following morning, I was awakened around 4:15 with the worst cramps I've ever felt. I noticed my wife was already using our bathroom, so I had to use the one in the hall. The next hour was torture, consisting of vomiting and diarrhea on levels to the point of unknown. In between explosions, I could hear the sounds, and my wife suffering through the paper thin was the idea that we had food poisoning first came up that morning. I was granted a brief reprieve from my sickness just long enough to go check on my wife and get a drink of water. I also took some to her, but she just couldn't keep it down long enough. Our son came into our room around now to tell us that her daughter was also very ill and had locked herself in the bathroom upstairs. His only concern was that needed nowhere to go to the bathroom. I told him to be considerate of others and stop being such a brat. If he needed to go so bad, he could go in the backyard. It was one of the few benefits of being a man, I suppose. I was planning on saying something else, but the cramps started again, so I had to run back to the bathroom. The whole time I was stuck in that place. The only thing I could think of was, why didn't I go to Chick-fil-A instead? I thought about it, but I knew my girls wanted to Italian, so we went there. I catch myself doing that a lot. It took some time, but I was able to purge myself of the poisoning while my stomach remained on the sour side that need to lock myself in the bathroom at past. Once again, I checked on my wife and found her condition to still be terrible. I also knocked on the upstairs bathroom door. When I got no answer, I knocked again and still got nothing. Something told me that this didn't bode well. I forced myself in and discovered my daughter unconscious on the floor next to a giant puddle of vomit. When I checked her pulse, I could barely feel anything. Try not to panic. I ran down to my bedroom and grabbed my phone. I dialed 911 as fast as I could and told them my daughter and wife were very sick and that my daughter was unconscious. I completely forgotten about myself. They were my only concern. The 2 ambulances arrived quickly and rushed them both to the hospital. I scooped up my son and we followed in my car. This would be the first long day of many in the coming weeks, and not just for my family. My daughter's illness was found to be the worst and landed her almost 3 weeks in the hospital. Some of it in the ICU on my wife's, though still being bad paths within the week, I myself was forced to spend the night to take fluids, but compared to them, I got off easy. I will quickly come to light that we were not the only ones to become sick after eating at that place. The rumors spread like wildfire through the hospital that a massive salmonella outbreak had started. These rumors were confirmed a day later when the news reported to the full extent of the spread. At that point, 14 people had been infected. 2 of them, an older couple, passed away the same night we first spent in the hospital. The numbers would reach 36 infected over the 2 days the restaurant was allowed to stay open. The final toll is reported to be 11. On the last victim, an 8-year-old girl who had been on life support for 2 weeks was allowed to pass by the family. As the winter of 2018 became the spring of 2019, life eventually returned to normal. Whatever normal is, my wonderful woman had been back home for a couple of months. So we decided to have the Christmas we never got to have all the presents we had purchased. We're still sitting in the spare bedroom. The week of Easter seemed appropriate. The rest of the family was invited over for food in which all the proper safety measures were practiced, by the way. And we exchanged presents with one another and had an all-around great time. I may be speaking for myself, but it was the best Christmas side celebrated in my life, and may go without saying that the little Italian place could never bounce back from all the bad press. They reopened soon after the problem was discovered. But no one would go back, and they soon closed for good. They'd already closed by the time we were able to go shopping at the mall again. And just getting up the courage to do that took a while. Of course, we wouldn't have eaten there anyway. I've learned my lesson. As of the 1st of September, when I'm writing this, we've only been back to the mall once since that nightmare of a meal. Even before stepping foot in the parking lot, eating anywhere in that food court was banned. My daughter has become a vegan since returning from the hospital, and I can't say I really blame her. I love to have the self-control to go that way myself. But I can't pretend to be something I'm not. These days. On the rare occasions we don't eat at home 99% of the time, we go to Chick-fil-A, and we've never had a bad meal from there. This has proven to me that I was right to want to go there in the first place. Before I wrap this letter up, I want to take the opportunity to express my deepest condolences on behalf of myself and my family, to the families of those who perish because of this awful act of negligence. Your loved ones' memories will always remain in our thoughts and prayers. Wrestled back and forth with whether I should share the story. Amy had been my best friend since kindergarten, and I would never want to do something that would have hurt her. But the fact is, her repeated bad choices put her in the place she ended up in. The local press has done their best to create a picture that isn't true. She is far from the girl that they had painted her to be, and the public deserves to hear the truth so they can make an informed decision regarding the outcome. Everything written here comes from a person that witnessed her actions firsthand and was present at the time the crime was committed. My pardon, it was negligible. And I have been punished for it. Anyone who says I betrayed her by testifying against her, I say in fact it was her who betrayed her friend by doing what she did. I certainly wouldn't have participated in any of it had I known what she had planned. If that's all we need to address, I'll get to my story. Amy and I both got our jobs at American Eagle around the same time. We loved the job, and working with my best friend was the coolest. Even when we weren't scheduled together. We spent most of our shift talking on the phone. Our managers didn't really care. They spent their shifts hitting on girls in the store. They had done the same to us when we first started, but we just laughed at them. They were almost old enough to be our dads, and that's gross. We had boyfriends anyway. Spencer, my boyfriend, was a senior and the quarterback of our school's football team. Amy's guy Neil was, I suppose, a real bad boy, just like the kind you see in the movies. He had the motorcycle and all that kind of stuff. They fought a lot, and the worse he treated her, the more she loved him. Even through all of this, she was still the most popular girl in school. All the teachers loved her, and regardless of how much she skipped, she'd never failed a single class. I'll admit, I was jealous of her sometimes. Her life seemed so perfect. Guys were always trying to hook up with her. But Neil was the only guy she cared about. Then one day everything began to change. Neil and Amy had gotten in another one of their 1 million fights, but this time they didn't make up and Neil started dating another girl. Megan also worked at the mall. She was an assistant manager at Hot Topic. Amy didn't know that they were together until she saw Neil and her in the food court one night kissing. She was super angry and confronted them. Even after Amy called Megan all sorts of terrible names, they both ignored her. Neil called her a psycho and the two walked away. She did her best to act unhurt. But when we got back to the store and went in the back room, she started crying. This was the first I heard that she was going to hurt Megan. But I didn't take it seriously, because we all say things like that when we ourselves are hurt. The next time we ran into her was on purpose. Amy had come to the store to take my break with me, and on our way back from the food court, we took the long way past Hot Topic. I wasn't stupid enough to not know she was looking for Megan. I had always had my friends back, and this night was no different. We walked into the store and Amy spotted her. She snuck up behind her and began calling her all sorts of terrible names again. Megan had been so surprised by Amy's appearance that she couldn't fight back. Instead, she ran into the back and hid. The other girls in the store told Amy to leave, and she gladly did, with a feeling that she'd won that round. I'm not sure if she realized this would cause Megan to have a strike back at her. But she did just 3 days later when she carved the word psycho into the side of her car with a key. Amy's parents had bought her that car for her 16th birthday, and she loved it almost as much as Neil. This had to be the night she decided to do it. She was so angry that her crying had morphed into blind rage. The only thing she said was, "I'm going to teach her a lesson." Nothing worse. So now perhaps you can understand why I was surprised by what she did. A week after the king, we sat in Amy's newly painted car waiting for Megan to come out to her car after work. The plan was that we would overpower her, throw her in the trunk, and take her to the woods to teach her a lesson. That was all. Instead, when she did come out, Amy jumped out of her car and started running toward her. She moved so fast I couldn't catch up. She'd managed to sneak up behind her once again. Megan caught a glimpse of me running up, but it was too late. Me grabbed her and spun her around, but instead of holding her, she began punching her and slapping her over and over. At this point, I don't even think Megan realized Amy had the knife. I didn't become aware until I was standing right next to them both and saw her white blouse covered with something dark. But I still wasn't sure what it was. It was all happening so fast. I yelled at Amy to remind her that the plan was to grab Megan and take her somewhere else, but she lives in her own world. The glint on the blade caught my attention and I began screaming at her to stop. But the stabbing and slashing continued for at least another minute until she was too exhausted to go on. Megan had stopped fighting back long ago. But the ferocity of Amy's attack kept her upright until she stopped, and she slowly slid down the side of her car and landed with a dull thump. If she hadn't already passed, she certainly wasn't moving. Her eyes stared blankly ahead. When I finally summed up the power to look over at Amy, she was completely covered in a dark mass and gasping with a wild look on her face. I was too scared to move now. She had me terrified of her. I was so enthralled. I didn't notice the group of people coming out of the movies approaching us. When they were close enough to see what was going on, the two girls screamed and they all ran off back towards the theater. While I was watching all this going on, Amy still hadn't moved and remained still, oblivious to everything happening around her. I knew it was just a matter of time before the cops arrived, and I kept telling her that we had to go, but she didn't move. She remained in the same spot the whole time, staring into Megan's empty, dead eyes. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave my best friend, and if she wasn't leaving, now I was going down with her. So I did. It wasn't until later when I had time to think about what had happened. Did I realize she had lied to me to get my help if she needed it? Maybe she thought I joined in somehow, not enough, but she had to have been crazy to think I would. I never claimed to be an angel or to be lacking some amount of blame. I fully admit that she didn't force me to be there that night. But had I known that she was planning what she was planning, there's no way I would have been there. Yes, I was willing to help her beat her up. But I see a big difference between that and something so cold-blooded as this. That's why I testified against her. She took the choice away from me, and in doing so, made me an accomplice. Regardless of what I did, my just being there while she did it makes me just as bad as her according to the law. A real friend would have given me the option to say no, but she didn't. That was the night of friendship and it forever. Now that I've served my 5 years and then free, it was important to me to get my side out, and I have. Whether anyone believes me or not, doesn't matter. No one who wasn't there to witness what occurred has the right to judge me or my actions. I know what happened. And that's all that matters. I'm not sure how common Christmas holiday thefts and robberies are in your area, but in mine, they become a real problem. Although the numbers have dropped somewhat since our state legalized the concealed carry of firearms, there's still enough idiots with a death wish to make it a concern. Last year, I had a very close call with 2 men that could have ended in very similar circumstances. We were around 2 weeks out and every place in town that sold anything was packed. I'd been fighting the crowds all day and I was starting to feel beat down. My last stop was the little Kmart at the end of the strip mall. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I got there. Even that late in the evening, the parking lot was filled. I did finally find a spot, and it was all the way on the far side. The walk through the doors took forever, and I could barely keep my eyes open. For the next 30 minutes, I grabbed anything I could think of we needed at home. Finally, I headed to Sporting Goods and picked up the bike I had purchased earlier for my daughter. It soon became clear that walking with a basket and a bike wasn't going to work. I left the bike with a checker and took the grueling walk to my truck. As I left the store, I noticed 2 guys loafing around the doors. When I made eye contact with one of them and he looked away, I had a bad feeling. There had already been multiple robberies in that same parking lot, so my mind went straight to that possibility. They did their best to look casual, but I caught them watching me more than once. I began my walk through the truck, watching them the whole time. Or trying to a quarter of the way there, one guy turned back and headed for the doors. The other continued to follow me. When I made it, I noticed the guy is circling towards me. I moved as fast as possible, throwing bags in the bed, and jumped into the cab. I pulled away just in time to avoid him. It was obvious I was being stalked now. And the hour I was in the store, the parking lot cleared out, and only a handful of cars were left. My safest place was going to be at the front doors. So that's where I parked. On my approach, I noticed the other guy standing near them, but I still had to park there because I had to go in and get the bike. My hope was that the cameras and chance of being seen by a shopper would dissuade them. I parked the truck and got out as fast as I could and ran inside. Odds were that the longer I took in the store, the better the chance they would have time to form a plan. I moved as quickly as possible. I grabbed the bike and jogged back outside. My efforts were all in vain. Just as I made it through the second set of doors, I could see both men pacing around just a few feet away from my truck. I did the only thing I could think of. I rolled the bike between them as I ran, and they jumped out of the way just as I had hoped. This would give me the small amount of time I needed to throw the bike into the bed and get to safety of the cab and lock the door. I unfortunately misjudged how long it would take them to regroup. Before I get the door completely open, I heard rocks crunching under someone's foot behind me, and I was forced to act in a way I'd hope I wouldn't have to. I pulled my pistol from under my shirt and pointed at the person behind me. I had been avoiding taking things this far. Even pointing a gun at someone, not to mention shooting a person, is a very serious thing to do. When I spun around and aimed at the threat, I got my first close-up look at the guy who had been following me through the parking lot. Moving so fast caused me to lose my balance and fall back into the door. This is when he got a full view of the gun and start moving towards me. His eyes got real big and he threw up his hands and surrender. Just under his breath, I heard him say, "Okay, not worth getting shot," while backing away from me slowly. The other guy had been about to run after his friend until he saw him with his hands up. I could only assume he knew what was going on because he turned and ran off. Soon his partner followed. I'm glad he was focused on the gun, not my shaking hand holding it. Or maybe he did. And this made him even more scared. I sat in the truck for a minute and caught my breath before I headed home. The tired feeling I'd had just an hour before was gone. It took at least 3 hours to relax enough so I could sleep. On the drive home, I mulled it over in my mind if I should call the police, but eventually chose not to. No one had been hurt and I got away with my presence. That must have gotten frightened enough for the remainder of the holiday. I didn't hear any more robberies or car break-ins. Looking back on the incident is still a very sobering experience. When I think of how close I came to have to shoot somebody, I pause and thank God it didn't get that far. He may disagree with my actions and say no one's life is worth a couple of Christmas presents. But I say to you that the happiness of my children is worth far more. The thought of having to tell my daughter that I let 2 men take her bike without doing anything to stop them breaks my heart. And unless you're a psychopath, it would do the same to you.